What's going on, everybody? Cleepus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be taking another look at the Cricut Innovate E5G and going over whether or not it's a good phone to buy in 2023. Now, as always, if you end up wanting to learn more about this phone, be sure to check out the description, where I am linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So with the Cricut Innovate E5G, we're getting a 6.6-inch LCD display with a 720p resolution, a PPI of 269, and a 20:9 aspect ratio. So in general, it's not the best display, I will say that, but keep in mind this is a really entry-level phone, and even at full price, it's going for around $159, so definitely really affordable. So on one hand, if you are looking for a more premium display, maybe you're consuming a lot of content like watching videos where the image quality is a bit more important, then yeah, you are going to want to spend a bit more and get something higher end that has a much better display. But in general, for what it is, I mean, despite only having a 720p resolution, things are still decently sharp, so for the occasional video or maybe social media or something like that, while not being the best, it still will be at least acceptable. And at 6.6 inches, the display is decently large too, so it's not like it's a tiny screen or anything. Really, my only actual complaint here is the viewing angles are not the best. So if you're outside in the sun, for example, or in any kind of bright area, it may be kind of difficult to see. But aside from that, for what it is, I do think the display we're getting here is at least decent. Now for storage, with the Cricut Innovate E5G, we are getting 64GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion. And granted, this is really not the best. At this point in 2023, finding a phone that has at least 128GB is really not necessarily that hard. But at the same time, I have seen phones in this price range that have only 32GB, like the Motorola Moto G Play 2023, for example. That phone is going for around the same full price as this. And yeah, that phone only has 32GB. And for the average user, I feel like 64, while not being ideal, is at least acceptable. So if you're maybe not really doing a ton on your phone, you're mindful of what you're putting on it, and you make sure to offload stuff like photos and videos onto a microSD card, then I do think the storage here will be perfectly fine. But of course, if you're more of a power user, if you're someone who's constantly downloading new apps and games and stuff like that, then while again, the storage here is definitely not terrible. If you are putting a lot of stuff on your phone, you might want to consider getting something that has a little more. Now for security features, with the Cricut Innovate E5G, this phone does have Face Unlock and a fingerprint scanner right here on the back. So definitely nice to get both options. But real quick, let's give the fingerprint scanner a try. There we go. One more time. And there we go. Real fast and responsive. No issues at all. And again, remember, this phone does have Face Unlock too, so if you want to use that instead, you always can. Now taking a look at the camera setup here, with the Cricut Innovate E5G, up front, we got a water drop notch designed for the selfie camera. This camera is 5 megapixels, so not the best, but also not terrible. Then on the back, we got a dual camera setup, with a 13 megapixel main camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. So honestly, the camera setup here is relatively featureless. Even for entry-level phones like this, you usually see at least a macro camera, and unfortunately we're not even getting that here, so kinda disappointing. But at the same time, if you're really just taking the occasional regular photo every now and then, or maybe using portrait mode, I will say, despite definitely not having the most amazing quality, the photo quality with this phone is surprisingly decent. So it's not like a terrible camera or anything, it just really doesn't have a lot of features. In addition to this, for video, the Cricut Innovate E5G does max out at 1080p in both the front and rear cameras, which this is probably not surprising, but keep in mind, there is no 4K video recording here. But again, when it comes to the general photo quality here, despite not being nearly as good as, say, a $500 mid-range phone, for example, for an entry-level device, I do think it can take some pretty good pictures. Now to give you an idea of what this camera can do, here's some pictures taken with the Cricut Innovate E5G. Probably not the best photos you've ever seen, but at the same time, I do think for a really entry-level device like this, if you are maybe taking the occasional Instagram photo every now and then, and you just want the option to get a nice photo when you need to, but you're not really a heavy camera user, I do think for that kind of light casual use, the photo quality here is definitely at least good enough. Now for the RAM and processor, with the Cricut Innovate E5G, we're getting 4GB of RAM with the MediaTek Dimensity 700 processor. Now I will say this processor has been around for a while. I've seen it being used in lots of different phones, but at the same time it's definitely not bad. I mean, it was never the fastest phone to begin with, and at this point, you see mid-range phones that are quite a bit faster than this. But again, keep in mind this is really more of an entry-level phone. And I feel like at this point in 2023, compared to like 2021 or 2022, the expectations people have for performance is a little bit higher. But despite this, for what it is, I do think this phone is actually decently fast. And while of course you're not going to want to be on your phone all day doing more demanding activities like high performance mobile gaming, for more basic casual use, if you're doing stuff like browsing the web, using social media, watching YouTube videos every now and then, and stuff like that doesn't really take a ton of power, for that kind of use, I do think you will get a pretty good experience here. And of course, as the name implies, the Cricket Innovate E5G is a 5G phone, so getting 5G connectivity for well under $200 is definitely a nice thing. Now, I ran a benchmark test on this phone using Geekbench 6, and here are the results I got. So what I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone, and then comparing your results to these, and that's going to give you a better idea of where this phone stands performance-wise compared to your current device. Because of course, depending on what you're coming from, it may or may not actually be a performance upgrade. But in general, I feel like, again, for what it is, definitely not the fastest phone out there, but at the same time, for the average casual user, it will at least get the job done. Now for the battery, this is an area where the phone is kinda disappointing because with the Cricket Innovate E5G, we are getting a 4000 mAh battery that supports 10-watt fast charging, so definitely not the best battery out there. Even in this price range, I feel like just at this point in 2023, I want to say most phones nowadays have 5000 mAh batteries, so seeing a phone that has a 4000 mAh battery is kind of disappointing, but at the same time, I mean, it's not terrible, and as long as you're not planning on using your phone heavily all day without charging it or anything like that, it should at least get the job done. So on one hand, if the battery is really a priority for you, then yeah, you can do better. But if you just need something decent that works, which is honestly really just what this phone is made to be anyway, it will at least get the job done. And when it comes to charging speed, just keep in mind, 10-watt fast charging is honestly not really fast charging, so don't expect the phone to charge up lightning fast or anything, but in my experience, the charging speed is at least decent. Now for the software, the Cricket Innovate E5G does have Android 12, and considering this is a really low-end carrier branded phone, I'm also not expecting it to get any kind of major updates, so if you are someone who likes to have the latest version of Android, you are going to want to get something else. But in general, I mean, again, considering this is a low-end carrier branded phone, I'm not too surprised. I have heard of carrier branded phones getting major updates, but it's not really that common. Typically, the software support isn't nearly as good as like a Samsung, for example, so definitely keep that in mind. But aside from this, things do run decently well. I haven't had any slowdowns or lagging or anything like that, which is honestly kind of surprising considering with the Cricket Dream 5G, which I kind of consider to be this phone's predecessor, it did crash every now and then. But with the Cricket Innovate E5G, I have noticed things are a little bit smoother, so unless you really want Android 13, the software is probably not going to be an issue for you. Now also keep in mind, the Cricket Innovate E5G does have NFC, which I was pleasantly surprised about considering, although I feel like every smartphone in 2023 should have NFC, that unfortunately hasn't really been the case. But luckily this phone does have NFC, so if you like to use tap and pay, keep in mind, you can use that feature with this phone no problem. But in conclusion, is the Cricket Innovate E5G still worth buying in 2023? Now, in general, I would probably not pay full price for this phone, considering you can get something like the Samsung Galaxy A14 5G, for example, for like $40 more, and I haven't actually directly compared the two phones yet, but I will say, even off the top of my head, the A14 5G is a lot better. So my point is, if you really want to maximize the value and features you get for the money, you can definitely do a lot better than this phone. But if you happen to get a good deal on it, maybe you can get this phone for like $10 or even free, and you're really just looking for something basic for more light casual activities, then in that case, this phone does have a decent amount to offer. I mean, again, the display isn't great, but the storage is at least acceptable. The camera is pretty good for what it is. The performance is also pretty good, and it does have NFC too, which again, I was really not expecting. So overall, if you are looking for a really affordable 5G phone, you don't really need any bells and whistles, and you really just want the basics, then I do think even at this point in 2023, the Cricket Innovate E5G is still worth considering. Now once again, if you want to learn more about this phone, definitely check out the description, where I am linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram, and as always, I will see you in the next video.